Egg prices are expected to soar, and that's all because of a flu that's causing birds to descend.
USDA data shows that avian influenza has killed almost 13 million birds within the last 30 days.
This bird flu made its way to the U.S. in 2022, and according to USDA data, the virus has so far infected or killed around 136 million birds thus far.
Here's MSNBC's Chris Hayes last night.
Donald Trump never learned that lesson. And look, he won the election anyway because voters wanted lower egg prices. So it's a particularly ironic twist that one of the main consequences of this ongoing bird flu outbreak so far has been killing lots of chickens and creating a massive egg shortage and skyrocketing egg prices. Maybe people will pay attention to that.
Michigan economics professor Justin Wolfers wrote on X, "The folks obsessively posting about egg prices for the past few years have gone strangely quiet just as egg prices hit an all-time high."
Publisher of the dossier, Jordan Schachtel, wrote, "1. The Biden admin ran a massive bird flu scam, which led to bad economic conditions for people who supply the eggs, and it forced the prices to skyrocket. 2. Trump has been in office for 3 days. Take a moment to digest this reality, economist professor."
Democratic TikToker Harry Sisson wrote, "Trump has been president for 3 days and egg prices are at all-time highs. Trump's America, haha."
Internet personality and Billboard charting artist Chandler Crump wrote, "If you asked a liberal about the economy 2 weeks ago, they'd say, Bidenomics is working. Everything is great. Trump is president now, and suddenly eggs are too expensive. Gas is too expensive. Funny how that works."
So I think what this mainly illustrates is how juvenile a lot of political debates have become. I mean, there are things that are outside of the control of whoever happens to be president of the United States at that time. And we see that in much, much bigger ways. And I was just scratching out some notes just before we did this segment about the presidents who've been affected by economic booms or busts that it's highly questionable they were really responsible for. Bill Clinton benefited from the tech boom in the 1990s. Before him, H.W. Bush was afflicted by a recession toward the end of his term. Neither of those men were necessarily, responsible for either the boom or the bust in that case. Now, perhaps you know more about who is culpable for the outbreak of avian flu than I do, but I just assume that this is a thing that has occurred that has killed lots of chickens, which is very sad, but has forced the price of eggs up. I'm not sure that it is either something for which Biden or Trump are really responsible.
No, I mean, so one of the conspiracies, quote unquote, that's been floating around is that Joe Biden, or his administration rather, was being overly cautious with the culling of flocks. Whether bird flu had infected the flock or just a nearby area, they were killing hundreds of millions of birds. So most of the bird flu deaths of birds in the U.S. have been due to intentional culling of flocks as opposed to these birds getting it and dying, which is interesting. But here's where the conspiracy comes in.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I'm trying to figure out what his motivation would be, but please proceed.
Joe Biden gave $590 million to a pharmaceutical company for development of an mRNA bird flu vaccine, and I want to say it was Pfizer, but don't quote me on that. Okay. But the CEO of that company was seen giving interviews talking about how we have to vaccinate every single bird in the United States for bird flu. So, you see the conspiracy, right? Joe Biden intentionally causing a panic about bird flu and killing millions of birds so that he can justify giving this massive grant to Big Pharma to vaccinate the birds.
I can't believe we now have like bird flu truthers who are arguing about that it's all a massive conspiracy. I mean, some of these things I just shake my head about. The broader issue of the economy is obviously one where inflation did hurt Biden very, very badly when it peaked in June 22, I think.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, and it was then above 9%. It was the highest inflation rate since the early 1980s. That clearly inflicted a political wound on him that he never really recovered from. Now, the Biden people would certainly argue that they should deserve some credit for inflation having fallen again quite precipitously, and it is now at more normal levels. They obviously didn't get any credit from the voters for that.
Nor should they.
I think, well, that's a whole other, I mean,
I know.
We'll get into that other debate. But in relation to I mean, Trump has suggested that he himself will now be able to tame inflation. We'll see how he gets along with that. Certainly the tariffs idea is one that I think most economists consider inflationary, but we don't yet know how far he's going to push through with that.
Yeah, I mean, the tariff question is one that is sort of dependent on how other countries respond, right? Because in some instances, the tariffs are being used to negotiate assistance on border policy. In other instances, like with China, it's to try to get China to actually have fair trade with the United States. They exercise all kinds of tariffs on American goods, but we don't give them the same level of tariffs in return. So it's more about fair and reciprocal trade than it is free trade. So there's a lot of elements to the tariff policy where it's not a broad same policy across the board, which obviously impacts how much prices would actually increase. Then there's the question of, are you putting tariffs on component parts of products, or are you putting it on the final good? Typically it's the component parts, which means the overall price increase is slightly smaller than it would be on the final product. But then also when you're coupling tariffs with a policy of both tax cuts for American incomes, as well as his other big economic policy, which is somehow just escaped my brain.
That happens sometimes, happens to us all. You'll be like Rick Perry trying to remember
exactly the three government agencies he wants to cut.
Trying to go. Well, let me just address
jump in.
the negotiating point, and maybe the other point will come back to you.
I hope so.
In relation to the tariffs, I hear a lot of people say, well, this is a negotiating position. It is trying to force or prod other countries to change their policy in ways that Trump wants. Now, that could be the case, that he is using it as a negotiating tactic. But in general, in negotiations, a threat only works if the opposing party thinks that there is a real chance of that threat being followed through upon. And I think the danger here on the tariffs question is, if the threat was followed through upon in terms of, say, a 60% tariff on all Chinese imports, or a 10 to 15% tariff globally, the danger is, and I think that a widespread belief is, that that would hurt the United States economy and American consumers so much that Trump is actually, in fact, highly unlikely to follow through at that level.
Well, I believe the foreign leaders do believe he's likely to follow through. Otherwise, Trudeau wouldn't have flown down to Mar-a-Lago almost immediately after the threat was made to try to negotiate with Trump, and then he ultimately resigned from his party because of criticism that he got for trying to negotiate. And Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico.
But hold on, he got into trouble with his party because he was being seen as too quiescent with Trump. So other people obviously don't believe it's serious, or believe that
the idiot liberals in his party who are about to lose power because they've mismanaged Canada into the ground. But at the same time, Claudia Sheinbaum initially talked a big game about how Mexico wasn't going to play ball, and she's since changed her tune as well and has met with several members of the incoming Trump administration. So obviously both of these people don't think that Trump is just bluffing. And then the other part of the economy that I was going to get into earlier in regards to tariffs was that when you couple tariffs with a robust domestic energy policy, you're going to see those prices level out, because energy policy, when you produce natural gas, oil, etc. at home, you're reducing not just the cost of energy, but also you have knock-on effects in other industries, specifically relating to food prices, whether it's transportation, whether it's manufacturing, packaging, processing. All of these other industries are going to benefit from energy prices being lower, being produced in the U.S. So I think you would see, because you have both of these things happening concurrently, the tariffs and the energy policy, that if there were a price increase, it would be very negligible.
Well, I think that is a more substantive discussion than asking who's responsible for the high price of eggs as a result of avian flu. Up next, President Trump speaks truth to power, or does he? More on Rising coming up soon.